Chapter 1. The Weight of an Envelope. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a flower bill and a notice from the landlord about the cracked pipe in the ceiling that had been dripping brown water onto Maisie's kitchen floor for 3 weeks. She almost missed it. The envelope was cream-colored, thick, the kind of paper that announced money without saying a word. Her name was written across the front in a script she recognized immediately. Sharp strokes leaning slightly to the left, the letters controlled and deliberate, the way his handwriting had always been. A handwriting that used to make her feel chosen. Now it made her fingers go cold. Rylan. Maisie stood in the narrow hallway of her rented room in the lower district of Asheville, still wearing her work apron, still smelling of bread smoke and herb oil from the bakery. The landlord's notice fluttered to the floor. The flower bill followed. She held only the cream envelope, turning it once, twice, 3 times, as if looking at the back of it would change what it meant. She should have thrown it into the fire. She knew that even as she broke the wax seal. Inside, written in that same controlled hand, was a single card with gold-bordered edges. You are cordially invited to celebrate the mating ceremony of Rylan Ashford and Celeste Vane, 3 weeks hence, at Ashford Hall. We expect your presence. Not request, not hope. Expect. The card had no kind words, no softening language. Just the raw, bare expectation that she would come, that she would sit in the hall where she had once stood at his side and watch him bind himself to another woman. She understood exactly what kind of invitation this was. It wasn't kindness. It wasn't closure. It was a summons designed to break her down in front of every wolf in the pack who had once watched her be discarded. Maisie set the card down on the small wooden table by the window and looked out at the cobblestone lane below. Evening was settling over Asheville's lower district like a damp cloth, the kind of cold that had no drama in it, only persistence. A child ran past dragging a wooden cart. A woman hung washing from a second-floor window. Life going on the way it always did, indifferent to the small catastrophes happening inside small rooms. She had been Rylan's chosen mate for 4 years. She had believed in him the way young women believe in things that shine, completely, without reservation, with a kind of devotion that doesn't leave room for doubt. When he'd looked at her across a bonfire 3 winters ago and said, "You are mine," she had felt it in her bones the way pack wolves feel the pull of the moon. Then Celeste Vane arrived in Asheville. The daughter of a wealthy border lord, beautiful in the way that announces itself. And Rylan had looked at Celeste the way he'd once looked at Maisie, and Maisie had understood, with the particular cruelty of clarity, that she had never been a choice. She had been a placeholder. He'd dissolved the bond publicly. In the pack square, in front of everyone, with words that were technically civil and emotionally devastating. He had not shouted. He had not been cruel in any theatrical sense. He'd simply stated facts the way one states weather. The bond between Maisie Callum and myself is dissolved, effective today, as if she were a lease being ended. She had stood there with her hands at her sides, refusing to cry. She was 23 years old, standing in a square full of people who pitied her, and she had not cried. That had been 8 months ago. She'd left the pack's residential quarter the following week, taken the room in the lower district, gotten the work at the bakery. She had built something small and quiet in hers, and she had told herself every morning that small and quiet in hers was enough. The invitation said otherwise. We expect your presence. She went to work the next morning as usual. The bakery opened before dawn, and she welcomed that, the way the heat of the ovens pushed back against the cold, and the hour demanded too much attention for the mind to wander. She needed dough. She pulled loaves from the stone shelf. She wrapped orders in rough linen and slid them across the wooden counter to the morning customers who came with their coins and their sleepy, preoccupied faces. Her employer, a stout woman named Oda who moved with extraordinary purpose for someone of her age and build, watched Maisie all morning the way a person watches weather they suspect is about to turn. You look like something's sitting on you, Oda said around midday, when the rush had thinned and they were restocking the back shelves together. Not work, something else. Maisie stacked a row of rye loaves without answering. The invitation, Oda said. It wasn't a question. Word traveled in Ashvale's lower district the way it always did in places where people lived close together, through walls, through windows, through the particular mechanism of neighbors who meant no harm and still knew everything. It's nothing, Maisie said. It's not nothing if you've been kneading that same section of dough for the last 2 hours without noticing. Oda leaned against the shelf and looked at her with the blunt compassion of someone who had lived long enough to stop pretending things were smaller than they were. Are you going? Maisie didn't answer. Maisie. I don't know. Oda was quiet a moment. Then, you know what that invitation is. You know why he sent it. Yes. Then you know that going without something to stand behind is just handing him what he wants. Maisie turned to look at her. And what do I stand behind? I'm a baker's assistant in the lower district. I live in a room with a leaking pipe. I have 3 dresses and a pair of boots I've resoled twice. Her voice came out flat, but her hands were pressed hard against the shelf, knuckles pale. What exactly would I stand behind, Oda? The older woman looked at her for a long, steady moment. Yourself, she said simply, and went back to stacking bread. Chapter 2. A wrong turn into the right place. She hadn't intended to go to the market on the north side. The north market was expensive, and Maisie had learned to be careful with her coins, the way you learn to be careful with things that run out, quietly, without drama, simply by habit. But Oda had sent her to collect a specific type of salt that only one merchant carried, and that merchant had recently moved his stall to the north side, and so she found herself threading through the wider, better-lit streets of Ashvale's upper district on a cold Thursday afternoon, basket over her arm, breath fogging in the gray air. She found the salt merchant. She paid his price with money she'd been saving for boot repairs. She turned to leave. And then the crowd shifted. The way crowds shift when something, or someone, enters a space and changes the weight of it. She heard the silence first, a ripple of it spreading outward from the main avenue, the kind of silence that isn't emptiness, but held breath. Then she saw them. 4 wolves in dark travel cloaks, dust still on their boots from the road, moving through the market with the kind of economy that comes from people who never have to justify their path. They parted the crowd without touching anyone. People simply moved, instinctively, the way animals move from the edge of a fire. Behind them, walked a man who made the 4 wolves ahead look like an introduction. He was tall in the way that landscapes are tall, not merely in measure but in presence, in the way space organized itself differently around him. His cloak was black wool, heavy, riding the movement of his walk. Beneath it, she could see the shoulder of a dark coat, the worn leather of bracers at his wrists, the kind of clothes that had been made well and used hard. His hair was dark, cut short at the sides, longer at the top, and there was a scar that ran from just below his left eye down to the edge of his jaw, pale and clean, the kind of scar that had healed years ago but never disappeared. He wasn't looking at anyone. Not until he was. Maisie had stopped walking without deciding to. She was standing 2 feet off the main path, basket in her hands, and the man in the black cloak had turned his head. Not fully, just a fraction. And he was looking directly at her. Not past her. Not at the general crowd. At her. His eyes were dark gray, the color of river water before a storm, and they stayed on her face for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough that it couldn't be accidental. Not long enough to mean anything she could name. Then he was past her, the 4 wolves closing the formation behind him, the crowd exhaling in his wake. The man next to Maisie, a grain merchant she vaguely recognized, leaned toward her with the excited reverence of someone sharing significant news. "That's the Alpha King," he said. "Evander Corrin himself. They say he's come to Ashvale to inspect the eastern border claims. First time in 7 years he's come this far south." Maisie looked at the space where the man in the black cloak had been. The Alpha King. She walked home with her salt and 3 seconds of gray eyes and absolutely no idea why her heart was still beating the way it did when something important had just happened. That evening, she sat at her small table, the invitation from Ryland still lying where she'd left it, and she looked at it for a long time. Then she picked up the pen that lived in the crack between the table and the wall, and she did something that surprised even herself. She began to write a reply. Chapter 3. The Proposition. The reply she wrote that night was not an acceptance. It was a question. Just one, in plain language without ceremony. Why do you want me there? She folded it, sealed it with a plain press of her thumb since she had no wax, and carried it to the pack's message runner first thing in the morning. Then she went to work and told herself she had done something sensible, and that the matter was, for now, closed. The response came before noon. A different envelope this time. Same cream paper, same gold border, but this card had only 4 words, written in that leaning, controlled hand. So everyone can see. Maisie read it twice, set it down on the bakery counter. Oda looked at the card, then at Maisie's face, and said nothing, which was perhaps the most eloquent thing she could have done. So everyone can see. See what, exactly? That she was still there? That she had not collapsed, not vanished, not crumbled into the kind of quiet grief that might have made Ryland comfortable? Or simply see that she was alone, that she would arrive without standing, without status, without anyone at her side, and take a seat in the back of Ashford Hall where the lesser members of the old pack sat, and watch him bind himself to Celeste Vane, and carry that image home with her like a stone in her chest. She understood it completely. The question was whether she would let it happen that way. She spent the rest of the morning with her hands in dough, and her mind turning the problem over, examining it from every angle, the way you examine a knot to find its loose end. She had no family of rank. She had no powerful friends. She had no one who would stand beside her in that hall and make the watching tolerable. And then, from somewhere in the back of her mind, from the part of her that had watched 4 wolves part a crowd without effort, that had registered 3 seconds of gray eyes and filed them as significant, a thought arrived. A thought that was either brilliance or pure desperation. She was not sure which. But she untied her apron, told Oda she needed an hour, and walked to the north side of Ashvale. Finding where the Alpha King was staying was not difficult. The entire upper district knew. He occupied the Corin guest chambers in the Civic Hall, a set of rooms kept specifically for dignitaries of his standing, rarely used because dignitaries of his standing rarely came this far south. The building was stone and old money, with iron lantern brackets and 2 wolves posted at the entrance in the gray and black of the King's Guard. Maisie stopped on the opposite side of the street and looked at those guards and the very solid door behind them, and revised her assessment of her plan from either brilliance or desperation to almost certainly just desperation. She crossed the street anyway. The guards watched her approach with the particular expression of people whose entire professional purpose is to prevent approaches like this one. A young woman in a work dress and twice resoled boots, carrying nothing, offering nothing, with the slightly too direct look of someone who has made a decision and is moving before the second thoughts catch up. "I need to speak with the Alpha King," she said. The guard on the left, taller, older, with a jaw like a shovel, looked at her the way you look at weather that has clearly misread the season. "No," he said. "I understand he's not available for—" "No." Maisie inhaled. "I'm not asking for an audience. I'm asking you to pass a message. That's all. Just a message." "Who are you?" the other guard asked. Younger, but not softer. "My name is Maisie Callum. I'm a former pack member of the Ashford Pack." She kept her voice level. "I have a proposition for the Alpha King that concerns the political standing of his visit to this region." The words had come out of her mouth with considerably more confidence than she felt. Both guards looked at her. The elder one's jaw did not change. The younger one's eyes shifted slightly. Not much, but enough. "Wait here," he said finally. She waited. The cold came in off the street and found every gap in her coat. She waited for long enough that she began constructing the story she would tell Oda about what had happened. The version in which she had tried something and it had not worked, and that was simply the shape of days sometimes. Then the door opened. Not the younger guard. A woman came out. Lean, dark-haired, with the look of someone who has assessed threats for so long it has become a resting expression. She was perhaps 30, wearing the king's gray and black, and she looked Maisie over with the efficient thoroughness of a person reading a document for traps. "I'm Sarah," she said. "The king's second. He'll hear you for 5 minutes. Don't waste them." The room they took her to was not the grand chamber she had vaguely imagined. It was a working room, a table covered in maps and correspondence, a fire that had been burning long enough to have settled into competent warmth, 2 chairs and a standing iron candle tree in the corner. It smelled of pine wood smoke, ink, and the particular clean leather scent of saddle packs that had been recently used. Evander Corrin was standing at the table when she came in, reading something. He did not look up immediately. She used that moment to look at him in a context that was not a moving crowd, and found that proximity did not diminish him the way it diminishes most things. The scar along his jaw was more visible here. He was perhaps 32, 33, with the kind of stillness that belongs to people who have stopped needing to perform authority because they simply have it. When he looked up, the gray eyes were the same as she remembered from the market. Present, direct. "Miss Callum," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Not loud, precise. "You told my guard this concerned my political standing. I may have overstated that," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "Sit down." She sat. He remained standing, which she suspected was not accidental. "You have 4 minutes," Sarah said from the doorway. Maisie folded her hands on the table and looked at the Alpha King directly, because she had decided on the way here that the one thing she absolutely could not afford was to seem uncertain. "I was the bonded maid of Rylan Ashford," she said. "He dissolved the bond 8 months ago to pursue a higher status match. He has now sent me an invitation to his mating ceremony, not out of courtesy, but to make a point in front of the people I grew up with." She paused. "I intend to go, but I need someone to go with me." Silence. Evander Corrin looked at her across the map-covered table and said nothing for long enough that the fire popped once, sharply, in the quiet. "You're asking me," he said, "to attend a pack ceremony as your escort?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because there is no one in Ashvale whose presence would make a stronger statement." She kept her voice clean and factual. "I'm not asking you to pretend anything. I'm not asking for your sympathy. I'm asking for approximately 3 hours of your time, in 3 weeks, for something that would cost you very little and mean a great deal." "And what does it mean for me?" he asked, not hostile, genuinely asking. "The Ashford Pack controls 3 river crossings on the eastern border," she said. "Crossings that have been in dispute with the Vane family's territory for 2 years. You're here to assess those claims. Walking into that ceremony, which both Ashford and Vane will attend, would give you visibility into how both families conduct themselves in social settings, outside of formal negotiation. That's useful intelligence." She watched him. She had constructed that argument on the walk over and was reasonably proud of it, even if it was slightly more polished than her actual knowledge of border politics strictly justified. Evander Corrin looked at her for a long moment. "You researched the border dispute," he said. "I had an afternoon." That thing happened in his expression again. Not amusement, exactly. Something that watched her more carefully. 3 hours, he said. 3 hours. He picked up the document he'd been reading when she came in, as if the conversation had returned to its natural order. "I'll send you word by tomorrow evening. Sarah will arrange the details if I agree." Maisie stood. She moved to the door. She had her hand on the frame when his voice came from behind her. "Miss Callum." She turned. "The border politics argument was well constructed," he said, not looking up from the document. "But it wasn't why you came here. She looked at him across the room. The fire between them settled low and orange. "No," she said. "It wasn't." She left before he could ask what was. Chapter 4. The Word That Travels. The word came the following evening, just as the light was going out of the sky, and Maisie was heating a small pot of broth over her fireplace, thinking about nothing particular and everything at once. Sarah knocked on her door without announcement, looked around the small room with an expression that revealed nothing, and handed her a sealed note. "I'll go. E.C." 2 words. No ceremony. Maisie read them 3 times, and then she sat down on the edge of her bed, and for the first time in 8 months, she allowed herself something that was not quite hope, but was shaped like it. The word traveled, as word always does. By the end of the week, everyone in Ashvale's lower district knew. By the middle of the following week, it had reached the upper district, the pack quarter, the merchant guilds that served Ashford Hall's household. Because Sarah had apparently seen no reason to be discreet about it, or perhaps had seen every reason not to be, and because the Alpha King's movements were the kind of news that attached itself to other news and carried it along. Maisie Callum, former bondmaid of Rylan Ashford, would be attending the Ashford mating ceremony with the Alpha King. She heard about the reaction secondhand, through Oda, through the grain merchant she'd stood next to in the market, through the woman 2 doors down who had a sister who worked in the upper district. Rylan Ashford had received the news at his breakfast table and had, according to his housekeeper, who had told the butcher, who had told someone else, gone very quiet and asked for the note to be read again. Maisie was in the bakery when she heard that part. She was sliding a tray of small seed rolls into the stone oven, and when Oda told her, she straightened up, and the expression on her face was something Oda had not seen there before. Not triumph. Not quite. More like the moment when you have been carrying something heavy for a long time, and you finally set it down, and your arms don't know yet what to do without the weight. "Don't get comfortable," Oda said, because she was the kind of woman who loved people by being honest with them. "You've stirred something. Stirred things have a way of splashing." "I know," Maisie said. "He may make it worse. On the day. He's a proud man, and you've taken something from him. The certainty of how the story would go. I know that too." Oda looked at her. "And the Alpha King. You know nothing about him. You walked into a room and made a bargain with a man you'd seen once from across a street." Maisie closed the oven door and turned. "What else was I supposed to do?" Oda was quiet a moment. "Nothing else," she admitted. "That's what worries me." That night, unable to sleep, Maisie lay in the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, where the crack from the dripping pipe ran like a fault line across the plaster. And she thought about what Oda had said. She had made a bargain with the most powerful wolf in the territory based on 3 seconds of eye contact and an afternoon of reading about border disputes. She knew nothing about Evander Corrin except what everyone knew, that he had taken the Alpha King's throne at 26 after his father's death, that he had stabilized the northern territories through means that people described variously as brilliant and ruthless, depending on how close they'd been to the situation, that he had no mate, and had turned down every formal proposal the great pack families had offered him, that he was respected in the way that storms are respected, completely, and from a careful distance. She had asked that man to spend 3 hours at a ceremony for her sake, and he had said yes, in 2 words, without negotiation. She turned that over in her mind in the dark. Why? The border politics argument was real enough. She hadn't invented it entirely. But he had told her directly that it wasn't the reason she'd come, and he was right. And still he'd agreed. She did not have an answer. The not having of it kept her awake longer than the cold did. 3 weeks. She had 3 weeks to figure out how to walk into Ashford Hall beside a man the entire pack would be watching, without flinching, without the old wound in her chest opening the way wounds do when you return to the place they were made. 3 weeks to become someone who could stand in that room and not need rescuing. She closed her eyes. "I can do this," she told herself. She almost believed it. Chapter 5. The Preparation. The first time Sarah came to the bakery, Maisie assumed it was to discuss logistics. Times, arrangements, which entrance they would use, how long they would stay. Practical things. The kind of things you discuss when a transaction is exactly a transaction, and nothing more. Sarah sat down at the small table in the back room where Maisie took her midday meal, looked at her with that permanent assessment expression and said, "What are you planning to wear?" Maisie blinked. "I have a blue dress." "Describe it." "It's blue. It has long sleeves. It fits." Sarah looked at her in the particular way of someone absorbing information they find professionally alarming. A mating ceremony at Ashford Hall will have every significant Pack family in the Eastern Territory in attendance. The Vane family will have brought their entire household. Celeste Vane will be wearing something that cost more than your yearly wage. She folded her hands on the table. You will be entering that hall beside the Alpha King. Every eye in that room will move to you within the first 30 seconds. The blue dress that fits is not sufficient. Maisie looked at her. "I can't afford—" "It's being arranged," Sarah said, in the tone of someone closing a door. "By whom?" "By the king. Before you argue, this isn't generosity, it's strategy. You came to him with a proposal that had strategic value. He agreed to it. Arriving with you dressed inadequately reflects on his judgment. This is a practical decision." Maisie opened her mouth, then closed it, because she recognized the shape of an argument she wasn't going to win. What arrived 2 days later was not a dress. It was a gown. Deep green, the color of pine needles in winter light, heavy silk with a subtle texture that caught the fire differently than it caught daylight. The sleeves were fitted to the elbow and then fell open in a clean line. The waist was structured without being severe. There was a short cloak in darker green wool that went over it, lined in soft gray. Simple. Precise. The kind of clothing that had been made to make the person wearing it look like herself, but better. Maisie held it up in her small room and felt something she hadn't expected. Not gratitude exactly, and not discomfort exactly, but something between the two. The strange sensation of being seen accurately by someone who had no reason to look that carefully. Sarah had also sent boots. Dark leather, well made, with a modest heel. They fit perfectly, which meant someone had estimated her size from observation alone. She wasn't sure whether to find that impressive or unsettling. In the week that followed, Sarah came twice more. Not for fittings. The gown needed no adjustment. But for what Maisie gradually realized were quiet, purposeful conversations. Sarah would sit across from her with a cup of something hot and ask questions that seemed casual and weren't. "How long were you with the Ashford Pack?" "Since birth." "My mother was a tracker. My father worked the Pack's eastern fence lines." "Do you have family still in the Pack quarter?" "No. My parents died when I was 16. I was sponsored by Pack Welfare after that. And Rylan Ashford, how did that begin?" "He noticed me at a Pack gathering when I was 19. He was 24. He was—" She paused, persuasive about what he wanted. Sarah absorbed all of this without visible reaction. But on the third visit, toward the end of a conversation that had moved through what felt like 100 careful questions, she said something that stopped Maisie mid-sentence. "He wants to meet with you before the ceremony." Maisie went still. "Rylan?" "No." A slight pause. "The king." She looked at Sarah. "Why?" He didn't say, which from Sarah, Maisie had begun to understand, was the equivalent of "I know," and "I'm not telling you." The meeting was set for the following afternoon, in the same working room where Maisie had made her proposition. She wore her ordinary dress, because she had decided that arriving in the green gown to a preliminary meeting would be trying too hard, and she had also decided that she would not try too hard for Evander Corrin. Not because she didn't respect the arrangement. She did. But because she had spent 4 years trying too hard for Rylan Ashford, and she was finished with that particular habit. He was at the table again when she arrived. Same maps, different documents. The fire was lower today, the room a degree colder. He had a cup of something dark and steaming near his right hand that he hadn't touched. "Miss Callum," he said, and gestured to the chair across from him. She sat. He looked at her for a moment. That direct, assessing look she was beginning to recognize as simply the way he looked at things. Not a performance of judgment, but a genuine attempt to understand what he was seeing. "I want to know what to expect," he said. "Walk me through what will happen in that hall. Who will be there? What the dynamic is." It took her a moment to understand what he was asking. Not a political briefing, not names and ranks. He wanted the human geography of it. The tensions, the histories, the undercurrents that wouldn't appear on any report. So she told him. Ashford Hall held perhaps 200 in its main chamber. The front rows would be pack elders and high-status families. The Ashfords, the Vanes, the 3 or 4 allied families who had positioned themselves around Ryland's rising standing. The middle rows would be merchants, skilled pack members, people of reasonable standing. The back would be everyone else. She described Ryland, proud without being loudly arrogant, careful about appearances, deeply attentive to who was watching him and how. A man who had always understood that status was performance and had performed it well. She described Celeste Vane. Genuinely beautiful, genuinely intelligent, with the particular confidence of someone who had always had the room. Not cruel, simply accustomed to winning. She described the pack elder who had publicly praised Ryland's decision to dissolve her bond. An old wolf named Bassett, white-haired and leather-faced, who believed that power deserved power and that sentimental attachments were a kind of weakness. Evander listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "And you," he said. "What do you need from me, specifically, on that day?" The question surprised her. She had expected him to tell her what the plan was, not ask what she needed. "I need them to see that I'm not..." She stopped, started again. "When he dissolved the bond in the square, everyone saw it happen to me. I need them to see that something else is also true, that I'm not only the woman that happened to." She looked at the table. "I don't need you to perform anything theatrical. I just need you to be there, solidly, the way you exist in a room." A pause. "The way I exist in a room," he repeated, as if tasting the phrase. "You know what I mean." "I do," he said, and then, after a beat, "I'll be there solidly." She looked up. For a moment, something in his expression was not the careful, precise thing it usually was. It was quieter than that, more settled. She stood to leave. "Miss Callum." His voice again, the way it had been the first time, stopping her at the door. "The night before the ceremony, there's a pre-gathering at the Civic Hall. Pack families presenting themselves before the formal event. Sarah will have told you." She turned. "I know about it. I think you should attend that as well." She frowned slightly. "That wasn't part of the arrangement." "No," he agreed. "I'm extending the arrangement." He picked up his pen. "Dress warmly. The Civic Hall is cold in the evenings." Chapter 6. The Night Before. The Civic Hall pre-gathering was, as Evander had predicted, cold. It was also exactly the kind of social event that Maisie had not attended since her life in the pack quarter. Large rooms bright with firelight and expensive candles, men in fine wool coats, and women in layered skirts and embroidered bodices, the smell of mulled wine and roasted meat, and the particular warm animal smell of a crowd of wolves in an enclosed space. Conversation layered on conversation. Laughter that had status in it. She arrived with Sarah, who moved through the room with the efficient confidence of someone clearing a path, and found Evander already present, standing near the far fireplace with 2 men she didn't recognize. Tall, hard-looking, with the bearing of people who reported to someone rather than to each other. He saw her when she came in. Not obviously. But he saw her, and the 2 men he was speaking to both glanced toward her briefly, recalibrated, and one of them leaned slightly toward the other, in a way that was not subtle. Maisie had worn the green gown, The room, she noticed. She made her way toward him at a pace that she hoped communicated composure, and he turned from the two men when she was close, with the ease of someone who had been waiting for exactly this. "Miss Callum," he said. "Your Majesty," she replied, because Sarah had told her that was correct, and she had been practicing it in her room for 3 days without admitting to herself that she had been practicing it. He extended his arm. An old formality. Escort position. The kind you see at formal pack gatherings. She took it with her right hand, her fingers resting on his forearm, and felt beneath the dark wool of his coat the solid reality of him, the complete absence of anything performed or uncertain. Be there solidly. He had understood her exactly. They moved through the room. She saw the moment people registered what they were looking at. Not just Maisie Callum in a green gown, but Maisie Callum beside the Alpha King, his arm offered and hers accepted, the two of them moving through the gathering with the kind of unhurried ease that said, "We belong here, and we know it." She saw Bassett, the old elder, pause mid-sentence to stare from across the room, his white brows drawing together. She saw 3 women she had grown up with, pack members who had pitied her in the square 8 months ago, look at her, and then look away, and then look back. She did not see Rylan until they had been in the room for nearly an hour. He was standing near the east wall with Celeste Vane at his side, and he was watching her. Not with the controlled composure she was used to from him, with something harder to name, something that had been constructed over months and was now showing a crack along one edge. Celeste Vane, who was everything she had expected, luminous in gold silk, with the carriage of someone born to be looked at, was looking at Evander. Not at Maisie. At Evander, with the focused attention of a woman making a calculation. And then something happened that Maisie had not anticipated. Evander Corrin, without breaking stride, without any change in his expression, said quietly, for her ears only, "Don't look at him." She turned her head slightly. "What?" "He wants you to look at him. He wants the moment where your eyes meet and he can read what's there." His voice was even, meant only for her. "Don't give it to him." She looked straight ahead at the far wall, at the candles in their iron brackets, at the back of a stranger's head. She felt Rylan watching her from the east wall. She did not look. And in not looking, she understood something she hadn't before. That Evander Corrin had agreed to this arrangement knowing more about it than she had given him credit for. That he had attended this pre-gathering and offered his arm and told her not to look. Not because of border politics, not entirely, not even mostly, but because he had understood from the moment she'd sat across from him with her hands flat on a map-covered table and told him the truth about why she'd come. That this was a thing worth doing. The question was why he thought so. She filed it away. Behind the warmth of the fire-lit room, behind the low conversation and the smell of wine and wood smoke, behind the strange new sensation of standing in a room she had thought would break her, and finding that it hadn't. Not yet. They were an hour from leaving when Sarah appeared at Maisie's elbow, with an expression that had sharpened past its usual watchfulness into something adjacent to concern. "There's a man asking about you," she said quietly. "Outside. Says he's an old friend of the Ashford pack." Maisie frowned. "Who?" Sarah's eyes were careful. "He says his name is Devon. He says he has something you need to know before tomorrow." Maisie had not heard that name in years. Devon had been her father's oldest friend, a gray wolf who had left Asheville before her bond with Rylan even began. She had not thought of him in months. She looked at Sarah, then at the room, then at the door. "I'll speak to him," she said. Sarah caught her arm, gently but firmly. "Not alone." Maisie looked back at her. Sarah's expression said the rest. Whatever this is, it arrived tonight for a reason, and reasons that arrive on the night before a thing rarely mean well for the thing. The fire in the iron brackets crackled once, sharply. The room went on around them, bright and warm and full of watching eyes. Chapter 7. What Devon Knew. The man waiting outside was older than she remembered. Devon had always been lean, but now he was the kind of lean that comes from years of hard travel, rather than natural build. Weathered down to the essential, with deep lines around his eyes and a gray stubble that matched the gray of his hair. He stood near the Civic Hall's side entrance in the cold, under the single iron lantern that threw orange light onto the cobblestones, wearing a brown traveling cloak that had seen considerable use. When he saw Maisie, something in his face shifted. Relief, she thought, with guilt threaded through it. Sarah stood 3 steps behind her, close enough to hear, close enough to matter. "Maisie," Devon said. His voice was the same as she remembered, low and careful, a voice that had always chosen its words like a man choosing stones to cross a river. "You've grown." "It's been 6 years," she said. "What are you doing here?" He looked at Sarah briefly, then back at Maisie. "I came because I heard you were going tomorrow, to the ceremony." He pulled his cloak tighter against the cold. "I almost didn't come. I've been telling myself for months that it wasn't my place, that it was old history and you were building something new." He paused. "But then I thought about your father, and I couldn't stay quiet." Maisie went still. "What about my father?" Devon exhaled, his breath fogged in the cold air. "Your parents didn't die in an accident, Maisie. I know that's what you were told. I know that's what the pack recorded." He looked at her steadily, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who has carried something too long. "Your father found something." In the Eastern Fence records he maintained. Discrepancies in the border agreements. Land that had been moved on paper. Crossings recorded differently than their actual position. Someone had been systematically falsifying the territorial boundaries for years, profiting from the confusion. Maisie's chest had gone very quiet. "Who?" "The Ashford family," Devon said. "Ryland's father, and someone helping him from the Vane side." He met her eyes. "Your father brought it to the pack elder Bassett. Trusted him. Bassett was supposed to investigate." A pause, heavy with what came next. 2 weeks later, your parents were dead, and the records your father had compiled were gone. The lantern light moved in a draft of wind. Maisie heard it distantly, the way you hear things when the center of your attention has been struck like a bell and is still ringing. "Bassett," she said. "Bassett buried it. I don't know if he ordered what happened to your parents or simply allowed it, but he knew. I knew too, and I ran instead of staying, and I've carried that for 6 years." Devon's voice had gone rough at the edges. "I'm telling you now because Ryland is marrying into the Vane family tomorrow, and when those 2 bloodlines join, whatever your father found becomes permanent. The falsified boundaries become the accepted ones. The Vane territory extends over 3 river crossings that shouldn't be theirs, and the Ashford pack benefits from the arrangement, and no one will ever look at it again." Maisie stood in the cold outside the Civic Hall and thought about a 16-year-old girl who had been told her parents died when their cart lost a wheel on the mountain road, and had believed it, because there was nothing in the world to make her believe otherwise. She thought about Ryland dissolving her bond. She thought about the invitation, so everyone can see. She thought about Bassett's face in the pack square 8 months ago, watching the dissolution with his leather features arranged in something that had looked like satisfaction. Her hands were very still at her sides. "Do you have anything left?" she said quietly. "Any record? Any proof?" Devon reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper, aged and soft at the creases. "I kept 1 copy. I shouldn't have run without bringing it forward. But I was afraid, and I am not proud of that." He held it out. "It's a partial transcription your father made of the original boundary records, with the discrepancies noted in his hand. His writing. His marks." He swallowed. "It won't bring them back. But it might mean something." Maisie took the paper. She felt Sarah move beside her, not intervening, but close. the way a person stands when they have recalibrated what they are standing next to. Devon looked at her with the eyes of a man who has delivered a weight and is not sure if it has broken the person he gave it to. "I'm sorry," he said, "for waiting so long. I'm sorry, Maisie." She folded the paper carefully and placed it inside the front of her gown, against her sternum, where she could feel it with every breath. "Go inside and get warm," she told him. "Find Sarah tomorrow morning. She'll arrange for you to be somewhere safe." Then she turned and walked back toward the civic hall, and Sarah fell into step beside her, and neither of them said anything until they were back inside the warmth, back in the light and the sound of the gathering. Then Sarah said, very quietly, "I need to tell him." "I know," Maisie said. She stood near the window while Sarah spoke to Evander in the far corner of the room. She did not look at them directly. She watched the candle flame in front of her and felt the folded paper against her ribs and thought about her father's handwriting, which she had not seen in 6 years, and would see again tonight for the first time, on a document that explained why she had been left alone in the world at 16. She heard Ryland's voice somewhere behind her, that smooth, controlled tone performing warmth for a nearby cluster of guests, and felt something that was not grief and not anger, but the particular cold clarity that arrives when the full shape of a thing finally becomes visible. This had never been only about a dissolved bond. When Evander came to stand beside her at the window, she did not turn immediately. He stood next to her, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him in the cold drift from the window glass, and he looked at the same candle flame she was looking at. "Sarah told me," he said. "I know." A pause. "Are you all right?" The question was direct and unornamented, and it deserved a direct answer. "Not entirely," she said. "But I will be." He was quiet for a moment. "What Devon brought you, if it's accurate, and I believe it is, changes the nature of tomorrow considerably. I know that too. The ceremony still happens, but what I do in that room changes." His voice was low, measured. "I need you to understand that. I came to Ashvale for border claims, and what you've just given me is the center of those claims. Falsified boundaries, a pack elder complicit in covering deaths to protect them, and 2 families about to permanently consolidate that arrangement." He turned to look at her. "This isn't your battle anymore, Maisie. It was never supposed to be. Your father tried to bring this forward through legitimate channels, and it cost him everything. I have channels he didn't have." She turned to look at him. This close, in the firelight, the scar along his jaw was a fine white line, and his gray eyes were very steady. "It is still my battle," she said. "I'm not trying to take it from you." "Then what are you trying to do?" He held her gaze for a moment. "Make sure you don't have to fight it alone." The room went on around them. Conversation, laughter, the clink of cups, the smell of warm wine and wood smoke. Bassett was somewhere in this room right now, she realized. He might be watching them. He might already be calculating what her presence here meant. Let him calculate. "Tomorrow," Evander said quietly. "Whatever happens in that hall, stay close." She nodded. He returned to his position near the fireplace. She stayed at the window a moment longer, her hand pressed flat against the paper beneath her gown, her father's last record warm against her skin. "I found something," he had written, in the transcription she hadn't read yet. "I found something and I need you to know." She would read it tonight. Alone in her small room with the cracked ceiling and the dripping pipe, she would sit by the fire and read her father's handwriting for the first time in 6 years, and she would grieve properly. And then she would sleep. Tomorrow required her to be whole. Chapter 8. Ashford Hall. The morning of the ceremony arrived gray and cold, with a low sky the color of pewter and a wind that came in off the eastern hills carrying the smell of pine and distant rain. Maisie was awake before the light, sitting at her table with the last of her fire, the paper read and reread, folded and placed in the inner pocket of the dark green cloak. She dressed carefully. The gown, the boots. Her hair pinned back in the way that Sarah had shown her. Simple, clean. Nothing performative about it. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the wash basin, which showed her in pieces, an eye, a shoulder, the line of her jaw, and assembled the full picture in her mind. She looked like herself, but gathered, the way a storm looks gathered before it arrives. Evander's carriage came at mid-morning. It was not ostentatious. Dark wood, simple iron fittings, the king's crest on the door panel in restrained gray and black. 2 horses, dark bay, well kept. 2 guards riding alongside, Sarah on horseback at the front. When Maisie came out of her building and walked to the carriage, the grain merchant across the lane was standing in his doorway, with his mouth slightly open. She did not acknowledge him. Evander was already inside. He looked at her when she got in and said nothing about her appearance, which she found she preferred to a compliment. There was something in the way he looked at her that communicated the same information without requiring words. They rode to Ashford Hall in a quiet that was not uncomfortable. The streets of Asheville passed the carriage windows, cobblestones giving way to the wider, better-maintained roads of the upper district, then the long approach through iron gates to the hall itself. Ashford Hall was old stone and old money, with the broad shoulders of a building that had been built to announce permanence. Today, it had flowers on the gate posts, white winter blooms, frost-touched, and the smell of pine boughs and candle wax drifting out through the open main doors. Guests were arriving in clusters, in their finest wool and silk, breath fogging in the cold. They saw the carriage. They saw the crest. The murmur began before the door was opened. Evander stepped out first, then offered her his hand. She took it and stepped down onto the stone path, and the cold air hit her face, and she looked at the crowd without flinching. For a moment the world was very still. Then they walked toward the doors, and the people parted, and they went inside. The hall was everything she remembered and worse. High ceilings with iron chandelier trees blazing with candles, long rows of carved wooden seats, the smell of pine resin and hot wax, and 100 wolves gathered in formal clothes. The front rows already filling with the families she had described to Evander. Ashfords, Vanes, the allied names. She saw Bassett immediately. He was in the second row, white hair and leather face, and his eyes found her the moment she entered. She watched him register what he was seeing, watched the careful blankness come down over his expression, like a shutter closing. She looked away first this time, not because she was afraid, because she had chosen to. They took seats in the middle section, not the back, not the front. The middle, where the substantial people sat, where she absolutely had not sat in all the years she'd been part of this pack. The people around them adjusted, shifted, made room with the automatic deference that surrounded Evander wherever he went. Rylan entered from the side corridor 20 minutes later with his groomsmen, moving to the ceremonial position at the front. He looked exactly as he always had, composed, handsome, performing ease. But she watched the moment he scanned the room and found her. The ease flickered. Just for a second. Just enough. Then Celeste Vane came in from the back entrance, beautiful in deep gold, moving with the grace of someone who had been told her whole life that rooms were made for her. The ceremony master called everyone to attention. Maisie sat with her back straight, and her hands folded in her lap, and Evander's shoulder 6 inches from hers, solid as stone. The ceremony was long and formal. Vows, the ceremonial binding of wrists, the elder blessings. Maisie listened to none of it. She was watching Bassett, who had turned in his seat twice to look at her, and she was thinking about what came next. What came next was this. When the ceremony master called for the elder blessings, the portion of the ritual where the senior pack elder formally recognized the union before the assembled pack, Bassett rose from his seat in the second row. He had taken 3 steps toward the ceremonial platform when Evander stood. Not loudly, not dramatically. He simply rose from his seat in the middle section, and the entire hall went silent the way halls go silent when the most powerful person in the room moves with intention. I have a matter of pack law to raise, Evander said. His voice carried without effort, clean and precise, filling the high-ceilinged space. Before the elder blessing is given, I invoke the Alpha King's right of review. I have evidence of falsified territorial boundaries within this pack's jurisdiction, sustained over a period of years, and evidence connecting those falsifications to the deaths of 2 pack members who attempted to bring the matter forward. The silence in the hall was absolute. Rylan had turned. His composed face had finally, completely, failed him. Bassett had frozen mid-step, white-faced, and in his stillness, Maisie saw the truth of what he was. Not the respectable elder who had praised duty and propriety, but a man who had made a calculation 20 years ago and had been maintaining it ever since, one silence at a time. Evander extended his hand toward Maisie without looking away from the hall. She reached into the inner pocket of her cloak, withdrew the folded paper, and placed it in his hand. He held it up. Not theatrically, not as a performance. Simply so that everyone in the hall could see that it existed, that it was real, that it had been brought here today by the daughter of the man who had written it. This matter will be investigated under King's authority, Evander said. Elder Bassett will present himself to my guard this evening. Rylan Ashford and the Vane family representative will also be required for inquiry. He lowered the document. This ceremony will not proceed until the investigation is complete. He sat down. The hall erupted. In the chaos that followed, voices, movement, Celeste Vane's gold silk a bright motion at the front, Rylan's voice raised for the first time she had ever heard it raised, the Vane family representative on his feet. Maisie sat very still in the middle of it all. Sarah materialized on her other side, from where exactly Maisie didn't know. Devon is with our guard outside, Sarah said quietly. He's safe. Maisie nodded. Evander was already on his feet again, his guards closing in from the periphery where they had been stationed. She realized now that they had been positioned throughout the hall, that he had known, had prepared, had been 3 steps ahead from the moment Sarah told him what Devon had brought to the lantern light outside. She watched Bassett being escorted toward the side door by 2 of the King's guard. He did not look at her as he passed. She had thought she would want him to, had thought she would want that last moment of acknowledgement, of him seeing her and knowing. But watching him go was enough. More than enough. She thought about her father maintaining those fence lines in all weather, in all seasons, finding the discrepancy in the records with the same careful attention he'd brought to everything. She thought about him trusting the wrong person with what he'd found. She thought about the girl she'd been at 16, standing at a graveside in the rain, being told it was an accident. The hall was still loud, still chaotic, still rearranging itself around the detonation that had gone off in its center. But Maisie felt, beneath all of it, something she had not felt in a long time. Solid ground. The aftermath of the hall. They left Ashford Hall through the main doors, not the side entrance. Maisie had expected to feel shaky. She had expected the particular collapse that follows adrenaline, the trembling hands, the suddenly heavy legs, the way the body presents its invoice after a thing is done. But what she felt instead, walking out through those broad stone doors and into the gray cold of the afternoon, was something quieter and more permanent than adrenaline, something that had settled rather than spiked. The wind came in off the eastern hills. It smelled of pine and the distant rain that had been threatening all morning and was now beginning to arrive. Soft, fine, barely more than a mist, the kind of rain that doesn't announce itself. She stopped at the bottom of the stone steps and turned her face up to it. Behind her, she could hear the hall still working through its upheaval. Voices, movement, the controlled commotion of Evander's guard managing the situation with the efficiency of people who did this kind of thing regularly. Sarah was inside, coordinating. Davin was with the guard at the eastern gate, safe, waiting. Rylan was somewhere in that building, having the most consequential conversation of his life with the King's investigator, and Bassett was already in custody, and Celeste Vane was. Maisie genuinely didn't know. and found she genuinely didn't need to. She heard the door open behind her, then footsteps on stone. Evander came to stand beside her at the bottom of the steps. He had removed his formal outer coat at some point. He was in his dark wool now, the one she recognized from the working room, worn at the elbows, familiar. He looked at the gray sky for a moment. "You're standing in the rain," he said. "It's barely rain." "It's rain." She lowered her face and looked at him. He was watching her with that steady, direct attention. And there was something in it today that was different from the assessed for threats quality she had first encountered. Something that had been present for a while, she realized, if she was honest about when she had started noticing it. "Thank you," she said, "for what you did in there. You didn't have to do it the way you did. It was the correct way to do it. You could have investigated quietly, filed reports, handled it through official channels over months." She held his gaze. "You didn't have to do it in that hall, in front of every person who watched him dissolve my bond. You chose to." He was quiet for a moment. The mist rain moved around them. "Your father deserved to have what he found brought forward in the place where it was buried," he said, "in front of the people who benefited from it being buried." He paused. "That wasn't for me to decide quietly. It was for the room to witness." She looked at him for a long time. The stone steps were wet under their feet. The pine smell from the hall's boughs had followed them out into the cold. "I walked into your working room with a half-constructed argument about border politics," she said, "and you saw through it immediately, and you agreed anyway." She tilted her head slightly. "I've been trying to understand why for 3 weeks. Something shifted in his expression. Not the not-quite amusement she had catalogued before. Something more direct than that, more settled. Because someone who builds a real argument on an afternoon's research to protect herself from a humiliation she didn't deserve, and then tells the truth when the argument is seen through, that's not someone you turn away. He said it without decoration, the way he said everything. "I was curious about you." "Curious," she repeated. "That's how it began." He held her gaze. It didn't stay only curiosity. The rain moved between them, fine and persistent, doing what rain does, making the world quieter, closer, more honest about its own edges. Maisie thought about the 3 weeks that had passed since she had walked into his working room. Sarah's careful questions. The green gown that fit without trying. Don't look at him. Stay close. The way he existed in a room, solidly without performance, without the need to be witnessed being powerful. She thought about how different that was from every version of strength she had been taught to admire. "What happens now?" she asked. "With the investigation. Bassett will be formally charged under pack law. The boundary records will be reviewed by my surveyors, and the falsified agreements nullified. The Ashford pack will face consequences proportional to the family's involvement. I'll need to determine how far that extends beyond Ryland's father, before I can say more." He paused. Ryland himself, his degree of knowledge is what matters. That determination will take time. "And the river crossings will be returned to their correct position." A slight pause. "Your father's transcription will be formally entered into the king's record. His name will be on the document that corrects what he found." She looked away for a moment. At the iron gate at the end of the path, at the gray-green hills beyond, at the sky that was going the soft dark color of early afternoon in winter. Her father's name on the document. His careful handwriting. His patient marks. Doing the work they were always meant to do. She pressed her lips together once, firmly, against something that wanted to surface. "He would have liked that," she said. "I think he was someone worth liking," Evander said. She turned back to look at him. The rain had settled into both of them by now, not soaking, but present, the way real things are present. His dark wool had gone darker at the shoulders. The scar along his jaw caught the flat winter light. "I need to go home," she said. I have things to think about." He nodded. The carriage will take you. She moved toward it. 3 steps, 4. Maisie. She stopped. He had used her given name. Not Miss Callum. Just her name, in his low, precise voice. And it sat differently in the air than titles did. She turned. I'll be in Asheville for another 2 weeks. While the investigation begins. He stood at the bottom of the wet stone steps, rain on his shoulders, entirely himself. I'd like to see you again. Not as an arrangement, not as a transaction. A pause, the kind that meant he was choosing his words because they mattered. If you want that. She looked at him across the short distance between them. She thought about 8 months of small and quiet, and hers, of bread smoke and risoled boots, and the cracked pipe dripping its slow brown water, of building a life on the ruins of one that had been taken from her, first by loss and then by dismissal, and telling herself it was enough. She thought about what Oda had said. Yourself. You stand behind yourself. Yes, she said. I want that. Something in his expression did not quite become a smile, but moved unmistakably in that direction, and she turned and walked to the carriage before she stood in the rain, staring at him for an unseemly amount of time, which was what she would have done if she'd stayed any longer. Resolution. The investigation took 6 weeks. Maisie knew the broad shape of it from Sarah, who appeared at the bakery twice a week with the particular air of someone delivering information as a professional courtesy, and not at all because she had, over the course of things, developed a respect for the woman she was delivering it to. Bassett confessed on the 3rd day of formal inquiry. He was old, and the weight of it had apparently been heavier than he'd acknowledged even to himself. And when the full record was laid in front of him in the king's formal language, he had simply stopped carrying it. The confession was complete. It named names. It confirmed what Devon had suspected and what the partial transcription had suggested. Ryland's father had initiated the boundary falsifications 17 years ago. Bassett had been complicit from the beginning, silencing the 2 people who found the evidence, directing the pack's official record to reflect the accident story. Ryland himself, and this mattered. This was the thing Maisie had waited for, without acknowledging that she was waiting, had not known. He had inherited a position built on a crime he was not part of. That did not redeem everything about him. It did not explain away 4 years and a public dissolution, but it meant he was a man who had been born into a corruption he hadn't chosen, and that was a different thing from a man who had chosen it. He came to the bakery on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks into the investigation, just before Maisie's shift ended. He stood at the counter in his ordinary coat, without the performance of composure she was used to, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has been comprehensively stripped of the story he had been telling about himself and has not yet built a new one. I didn't know, he said. I know you didn't, she said. That doesn't fix. No, she agreed. It doesn't. He stood at the counter for a moment. Then, I'm sorry, for the square, for the way I did it. He didn't offer explanations. She gave him credit for that. I know, she said again. Then, go build something honest, Rylan. That's all there is to do. He left. She watched him go through the bakery window, growing smaller along the cobblestone lane until he turned a corner and was gone. She had expected that moment to feel more dramatic than it did. Instead, it felt like a door closing properly. The soft, definitive click of a latch finding its place. She turned back to the bread. Oda appeared from the back room with 2 cups of something hot and set one on the counter in front of Maisie without comment. They drank their tea in the warm, flower-smelling silence of a bakery in the mid-morning, and it was enough. Davon stayed in Asheville. He took a small room in the lower district, 3 streets from Maisie's, and found work with a builder who needed an extra pair of experienced hands. He came to the bakery every Sunday morning and bought a small rye loaf and sat at the back table for an hour. And sometimes they talked about her father, and sometimes they just sat, and both kinds of Sunday were good in their own way. He had carried his guilt for 6 years, and she could see him, slowly, setting it down. She did not make it easy for him, but she made it possible. The boundary records were formally corrected in the 5th week. Her father's name, Callum, Eamon Callum, pack tracker and border warden, appeared in the king's official document as the original source of the evidence. Maisie received a copy, rolled and sealed with the king's crest, and she put it on the shelf above her fireplace where she could see it from the bed. The dripping pipe was fixed by the landlord in week 4, prompted by a short note delivered to him by one of the king's guard, which the landlord read and then acted upon with remarkable speed. Epilogue. What remained? On the last evening before Evander's court returned north, he came to the bakery after closing. Maisie had known he would come. Sarah had told her, in the way Sarah communicated things she considered important, which was by stating them plainly and leaving no room for misunderstanding. She had stayed late to clean the ovens, which needed doing anyway, and also gave her something to do with her hands, which was useful. He knocked on the bakery door at the hour when the lower district was settling into its evening. Lanterns being lit in windows, the smell of suppers starting, a cold, clear sky overhead for the first time in days, stars beginning to appear in the east. She opened the door. He was in his traveling clothes, the worn, dark wool, the leather bracers, the cloak that meant the road. Behind him in the lane, she could see the carriage and horses, Sarah already mounted, the small company of guard that moved with him wherever he went. He looked at her. She looked at him. 6 weeks of twice-weekly conversations in the Civic Hall's smaller sitting room, of talking about the investigation, and then gradually, inevitably about everything else, about her father and her mother, about what she wanted to build in Ashvale, about the particular strange freedom of a small life that is entirely your own. He had listened the way some people listen, which is to say completely, without waiting for his turn to speak. She had learned things about him in return. That he had taken his father's throne under circumstances that still complicated his sleep sometimes. That he trusted very few people, and Sarah completely. That he had a dry and understated humor that emerged slowly, like something deciding whether the conditions were safe. She had come to know him. Really know him. Not the Alpha King, not the figure who parted crowds, but the man who drank tea that went cold because he forgot about it when he was reading, who had asked her 3 separate times about the specific way bread dough was supposed to feel when it was ready, and had listened to her answer with genuine interest each time. She was going to miss him. She had known she would for at least a week, and had not said so, because some things you carry quietly until they can be put down in the right place. "You're leaving in the morning," she said, at first light. He looked at her steadily. "I'll be back in 6 weeks. The investigation requires my presence for the formal sentencing. I know. And after that..." He paused. Not uncertainty, she understood now. He paused when something mattered. "There are things I'd like to discuss, about what comes next, for both of us." She leaned against the door frame and looked at him in the lamplight from the street, this man who had walked into her careful small life and treated it as something worth protecting, who had said, "I'll be there solidly," and had meant it in every sense. "Come back then," she said, "and we'll discuss them." He looked at her for a moment, that gray-eyed, complete attention, and something in his face settled the way it settled when he had made a decision and was at peace with it. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small folded paper and held it out to her. She took it, puzzled, and opened it. It was a sketch. Simple lines, done in pen. The eastern border, with the river crossings marked at their corrected positions. And beside the third crossing, in small, careful handwriting, she didn't recognize as his, until she looked at it twice. Callum's Crossing. Her father's name. On the map. On the land he had walked and maintained and died trying to protect. She looked up. Evander was watching her with the expression that wasn't quite a smile, and she understood that this had not been a decision made lightly or quickly. That someone had sat with this and thought about it and determined that it was right. That he had determined it. She pressed the paper closed in her hands. She did not trust her voice for a moment. "Go north," she said, when she could. "Come back safe." He inclined his head once, not a bow, not a formality, something more private than that, and turned toward the carriage. She stood in the bakery doorway and watched them go. The horses moving down the cobblestone lane, the carriage rocking gently on the uneven stones. Sarah at the front with her straight-backed efficiency. The small company of guard falling into formation. The lanterns made orange pools on the wet cobblestones. The cold was clean, and the stars were clear in the east. She watched until they turned the corner at the end of the lane, and the sound of hooves faded into the general quiet of the evening. Then she went back inside. The bakery was warm, smelling of the day's bread in the cooling ovens. She set the folded map on the back table and looked at it for a moment, at the small, careful letters of her father's name written on a piece of the world that was now, officially, correctly, his. She thought about the girl she had been the night the cream envelope arrived, standing in a cold hallway with flour on her apron and a landlord's notice on the floor, feeling the full weight of being alone with no one to stand behind her. She thought about how far that girl was from this room, this evening, this folded paper. She was not the same person who had broken that wax seal. She was not the woman the invitation had been designed to diminish. She was Maisie Callum, daughter of Eamon Callum, whose name was on the corrected map, resident of the lower district of Ashvale, baker's hand, and, it turned out, a person who walked into the working rooms of Alpha Kings and made propositions that changed everything. She placed the map carefully in her coat pocket, turned down the bakery lantern, and walked home through the clear, cold night. Above her, the stars had fully arrived in the east. The sky was enormous and unhurried, indifferent to small lives in the way that enormous things are indifferent, not cruelly, simply by scale. But small lives had their own weight, she had learned, their own gravity, their own particular and irreplaceable claim on the world. She had built something small and quiet, and hers. And now, without losing any of it, she was beginning to build something more. The door of her building closed behind her, with a soft, definitive sound. The lane was quiet. The story was complete.